So, namaste everyone, welcome. Again, I'm Ankur Patel, Director of Advancement for Hindu University of America. And it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to our weekly Saturday webinar. This week's topic is Western Psychology versus Antaranga Yoga. And our first panelist is Dr. Anand Varanjpe. And you can take a quick look at his bio right here briefly. This is the person who wrote the book on East meets West. From an academic perspective, he is the expert, written many books, and will bring that Western academic perspective to Hinduism in a lot of ways. As an American-born Hindu, I know what it's like being born into something and not understanding how we fully interact. So I'm looking forward to that part of the conversation. The second panelist we have is Mr. Raghu Antanandarayan, and he is actually one of the people who's studied with Krishnamacharya ji, and reading some of the history and seeing how the traditions and the culture has been carried forward and spread. Raghuji is bringing a real Hindu kind of centered, focused, and perspective from culture, tradition, from within the tradition. So we're going to have this conversation between these two experts, wise folks, and also inputting, we'll have Ramaji, who's a student at HUA and actually took some yoga courses over the last couple quarters and will be participating in the conversation as well. But before we get started, let me hand it over to Kalyanji Vishwanathan, the president of HUA, Hindu University of America, who will give us a little framing for the conversation and give our welcomes and introductions. Again, if you can, in the chat and the question window, keep those things separate. And without further ado, let me hand it over to Kalyanji, who will give us some framing for our webinar today.
Okay, fantastic, everybody. First of all, thank you all for joining. You need to mute. You need to mute. I just don't understand. Okay, I have muted everybody, and please, if you want to speak, you have to unmute now. So welcome to all of you. We have about 117 participants so far, and I'm going to pose a question in the chat window for all of you. Okay, just to respond in the chat window so that we can get used to the chat window. Okay, so the question is, which city are you from? You can respond by saying the name of the city where you are logging in from. Okay, Chicago, Piscataway, Chicago, New Delhi, Madhya Pradesh, Houston, Baroda, San Jose, New Delhi, Toronto, Seattle, Singapore, Trinidad, Mysuru, Plano, Texas, Chennai, Houston, Redondo Beach, Visakhapatnam, Vancouver, Trinidad, Tel Aviv, fantastic, Bihar, Fremont, Santa Rosa, Vadodara, wonderful, great. We have a fantastic group of people here assembled. So I just want to mention to all of you that you can always type something in the chat window as long as it's relevant to the conversation we're having. Now, I want to begin by recognizing that Dr. Anand Varanjpe, Professor Anand Varanjpe has spent the better part of probably 50 years or so in the field of psychology. He was trained in Western psychology primarily, but over the years he's developed a deep interest in Indian psychology, or the yoga traditions, and the traditions of mind, engaging the human mind from an Indic and a yoga perspective. So he has been deeply researching many yoga-related texts and so on. So we would welcome his perspective straddling those two worlds. And Raghuji has been a practitioner of yoga primarily from an inner yoga perspective, Antaranga Yoga, and we want to hear from him his deep insights in that domain. So Anandji, I want to start this panel by
yes,
inviting a little bit of a biographical description of your own journey in the field of psychology. And let me start it off with this question. It's like there's a lot of argument in the West about whether psychology is a science or it is merely a pseudoscience, something that pretends to be a science, but it's not quite a science. Or is it just non-science? Is it, it is so not scientific that it cannot even be, construed as science anywhere closely. Okay. So with that question, over to you, sir.
okay. It all depends on how people understand what science is. Science as what physicists or chemists or biologists do, if that's the criterion, then of course there has been an attempt to fashion psychology after that model. But it has not worked. And those people who are in what is called hard sciences like physics, chemistry, biology, and so forth, they consider many human sciences as not sciences anyways. There has been a tradition from Germany which makes a difference between what is called natural sciences and human sciences. So human sciences like anthropology, sociology, history, philosophy, and so forth. Now, political science calls itself science, but what that means is everybody's guess and understanding. So as to psychology, yes, it has been called pseudoscience because people who are grounded in certain view of the world and of truth, which is attainable only through observations and observations of the world in a certain sense, in a fashion in which the scientist is absent from the scene of what is being observed. And that's what makes all the difference. If you think, or if anybody wants to see himself or herself as part of the study, then of course it opens up a very different perspective, different domain of inquiry than what science wants us to be.
So let's move forward from that perspective. We'd like to hear a little bit about yourself and your journey and your reflections on Western psychology and Antaranga Yoga.
Okay. Okay, I'm ready. You see, as the introduction indicated, yes, I have over 50 years now that I'm into psychology and taught Western psychology in what I can call the West of the West here in the Pacific Coast. Somebody once said that you come from east of the East to west of the West, but there I am. So having studied psychology in different ways, I will say something about my journey and at the same time about what makes Indian perspective on psychology different from the so-called Western perspective, which is, by the way, not one perspective. There are different perspectives within psychology. It's an extremely widespread and diverse field of studies. Without going into that, I will address this question in light of my own experience and journey. How come I started in Western psychology and have tried to immerse myself entirely into Patanjali mode of psychology? What happened was that my exposure to psychology, training in psychology back in India, starting in 1955, was at the hands of one professor who was trained in Cambridge in the guidance of Sir Frederick Bartlett, one of the great names in British psychology. And the kind of psychology, if I can call it, imported in India was a study of memory in a, if you want to call it, mechanical way. Literally mechanical in the sense that we were supposed to learn nonsense syllables like N-U-X, Y-I-V, or M-E-B, which are designed not to have any meaning. And then we are presented those on what is called a memory drum, which exposes each word to you mechanically in front of you. And then you are supposed to recite those words. Suppose I take about 15, 16 trials of reciting it fully, one after the other. That's okay. You learned something. Have you remembered something? Next day, you are asked to recite the same thing. Out of the 20 words, suppose I can recite correctly 10 words. That means that I have remembered some and forgotten some, and then you work out numerically how much you have learned, and so on it goes. You can do that 3 days later, 1 month later, or whatever. This is a, so to speak, a mechanical way of addressing issues of memory. It was wonderful. I learned the technique. The laboratory was my field. I didn't fail in doing anything. Rather, I was asked to be in charge of the lab in which I was trained. So it's not because of my failure to do it that I turned to something else. But something happened, a strange accident in my life, that I was exposed to an essay by a psychoanalyst on the nature of identity, the problem of identity. It was written by a disciple of Freud's daughter. His name was Professor Erikson. Once I read it, I fell in love with that perspective. Why? Because I had the impression that what I was taught as psychology had nothing to do with me. It was something to do with everybody else. Whereas what Professor Erikson was talking about is my stuff, because, believe it or not, as a young person, I was confused about where I was, what I was going to do, and that's exactly what Erikson was talking about. He called it the identity crisis, and I had one. So it was my kind of psychology because it was personal rather than impersonal. Now, a series of accidents is what, at least for me, life has made. So accidentally, I met Professor Erikson, and eventually I landed at Harvard to be able to be his direct student as a postdoc fellow. Now, when I came to Harvard, I was working in the William James Hall, which is the psychology building, and my professor's place, his office was on the 3rd floor, and I got to learn that on the 12th floor, there was another very famous psychologist by the name of B.F. Skinner. The first day I was there before campus and I talked to somebody, and he was from the laboratory upstairs. I never saw him once. The strange thing was there was absolutely no communication between 3rd floor and 12th floor, two different kinds of psychology. Okay, that is how diverse the field is, but what's the difference? Okay, I've got to say something about what the work upstairs on the 12th floor. As any of my colleagues in the psychology department downstairs had nothing to do with upstairs, a friend of mine who was not a psychologist took me up. I said, "You are here, at least you should go see." What did I see? In Skinner's laboratory, there's a bunch of contraptions in which pigeons were harnessed. They couldn't stand, they were harnessed. and they were picking. So I became curious. As a matter of fact, I said something at some time later to Professor Erickson, said that I want to study Skinner. He said, why do you want to do that? In other words, there was that much of difference in their perspective. Now let me tell you something about Skinner's psychology so that you can see where Western psychology is, why I didn't quite relate to it. Skinner's psychology has the first problem. Of course, you said, Kalyanji, first about pseudoscience. His kind of psychology, which was called radical behaviorism, wants to completely follow the science model. Okay. So according to him, there was no such thing as mind, and there was no such thing as self, because you have to learn everything about. As a matter of fact, he wrote a book in which he said, psychology is about the other one, not yourself. That's the kind of psychology he was doing. Now, strange thing once again, that somebody back when I was in India had told me that it was Patanjali who represented the essential aspect of psychology in the Indian tradition. If that was the way where the focus was on the self, tada drashtu swarupe avasthanam, if it has to be about yourself, that's a different kind of psychology. As a matter of fact, when I started as a graduate student back in India, when I started to read Patanjali, I didn't understand a bit. I didn't know why it could be called psychology at all. That is how much difference there was. Back to Skinner. According to him, you know, the way we were told back in India in Western psychology, the purpose of psychology is to predict and control behavior. They never told us whose behavior is to be controlled and why. Okay. It was somebody else's behavior. And mind you, Skinner's psychology works. I can tell you how and why. My wife is a speech therapist, and she has the problem of getting younger children, 3, 4, 5 years old, who cannot speak properly. She uses Skinner's technique. What are Skinner's techniques? Basically, use in a very controlled and systematic fashion rewards that you give somebody to do something. And that way it works. As a matter of fact, some of my friends who are psychologists working in the clinical mode, they swear by it. It works. But then the whole problem is that it is not about self, because the idea of self is just totally said. There is no such thing as self that exists. This is Skinner's psychology. Now you can see how Patanjali's psychology has been different, because there is basically difference. The difference is that whereas Skinnerian or behavioristic psychology want to control somebody else's behavior, they do talk about self, but but that's another complicated issue I will not go into. The essential aspect of Patanjali's psychology is self-control. You control your body and your own mind, not somebody else's. Now, the motto that Skinner worked under came from Francis Bacon, who said that knowledge is power. Whereas the Indian perspective of knowledge is sa vidya ya vimuktaye. That is knowledge, that is the right kind of knowledge which allows you to release yourself from the fetters of being entangled into the reality of mundane reality around you. You release yourself from the controls of the entire environment. So that is how much difference there is in different perspectives. Now, back into studying Patanjali. What I also want to say is, at one time, back in about 1975-76, I met Professor Erickson once again after having been his student for a year. And I said to him that you say that people change and they learn to cope, how to cope with change, and you keep on moving and moving and moving. And do you ever find yourself? Actually, you don't find yourself. I'll tell you a bit of a story. A very, very close friend of mine who had gotten everything. He was a good artist, a good engineer, in a very well-paid job, living in a comfortable place, had a son and a grandson. Everything was going fine. I'm not talking about Erikson. I'm talking about the implications of Ericksonian psychology. So this gentleman was a patient of cancer, and there was only a few days after that he was going to live. He asked me to come and see him, a bosom buddy of mine. And I said, and he started crying. I said, so-and-so, why are you crying? So he said, my projects are unfinished. That is the story of Ericksonian psychology. It tells you that people change, that they can learn to cope, but the projects of life never finish. So suppose I am on the deathbed, so to speak, I look back and I find that maybe I should have gone some other way. There is no time to correct myself. What is the solution out of this possible tragedy? The tragedy is solved if you have found something that is worth keeping ever. And you don't need to run after a horizon that recedes as fast as you go toward it. That's self-actualization. Self-realization is discovering something that you are there. I asked Professor Erikson about this in a long personal conversation way several years after I finished my postdoc with him. And I said, sir, Patanjali says that it is possible to find something in you. It is inexhaustible. It doesn't need to change. Is that so? He says. I said, yes, that's what Patanjali says. Then at that time, I said, is it worth pursuing the difference between your perspective and Patanjali's? He said, yes. So that is how, after learning psychology at the hands of a student of Freud's daughter, I made a pitch to myself that, yes, I've been studying it, but lately it looked like yoga was everywhere. And then why don't I join the crowd once again, which I missed. But now I'm saying the last little bit into a last couple minutes now at my disposal that I'm frustrated with the current scene of psychology because by and large, what happens in the name of psychology, yoga, is asana, at best some pranayama. And there is unlimited amount of research going on showing the benefits, health benefits of, I'm little acquainted with what's happening. And yes, there is more and more proof accumulated that the asanas work, the health benefits. But then so what? Now, if I go look at what Patanjali has been saying, he says, start with yama and niyama. Yama is basically what you shouldn't do. You shouldn't steal, you shouldn't speak lies, you shouldn't, and so on. And that is something, if it is the starting point, I think people will just leave. Because who wants to be told how to behave? How to make your body flexible, that's a different issue. So if you start with that, and then the Kriya Yoga is something that you are supposed to start with, and Raghuji will tell you more about it. Tapa, Swadhyaya, and Ishvara Pranidhana. So Tapa is learn to control yourself. There are all different kind of religious rituals which allow you to put restrictions on your own behavior, and you learn self-control. Swadhyaya is self-study think of who you are and study the texts like those of yoga or Advaita and so on, or Buddhism for that matter. And that's a preparation. And Ishvara Pranidhana means you surrender the fruits of all your actions to Lord, which is basically Karma Yoga, as Gita tells you, or Lokmanya Tilak explains. But instead of this kind of thing, if we are doing only asanas, you will benefit. Why not? That's wonderful. But then, coming to Raghuji's perspective, if you can discover Arjuna's confusion or Bhishma's helplessness that is within you, now you are opening up a different way of perspective. As a matter of fact, after Yama, Niyama, Asana, Pranayama, and then what are you supposed to do? Pratyahara. Pratyahara is turning inwards. Okay, and if that is avoided in the name of yoga, what are you doing? So my general impression has been that Raghuji's approach to psychology, and especially way of solving people's problems in a clinical sense, is an extremely innovative and apparently effective program. And I would now leave it for Raghuji to explain what he is doing.
So Raghuji, kindly unmute yourself if you can. Raghuji, you're on mute, okay? Yeah, there you go.
Is that okay?
Yes, very good. We can hear you now. So just a brief interlude. Anand Varanjpe is speaking from Vancouver, British Columbia. And Raghu Ananthanarayanan is speaking from Kotagiri, the hills of Kotagiri in Tamil Nadu in India. So we are fortunate that in this globalized world, under the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, we're able to enjoy diverse views from people so far away from each other. With that little prelude, Raghuji, so you have been experimenting with Antaranga Yoga, inner yoga, and you've done a lot of things over a long career with corporates, with individuals, with groups, and you found very effective ways of working with people. Why don't you take us through your concept of Antaranga Yoga, what it means, and its potential for inner transformation for people?
Thank you. I was quite fascinated with Anandji's almost panoramic view of the whole context. I'll start with from where Anandji left off, because there are lots of misunderstandings about the nature of yoga, because the word yoga itself has now become equated to just asana, maybe pranayama, and some few exercises that people refer to as meditation, and so on. So we'll put it in perspective and then draw into what we're talking about. See, yoga talks about the mind primarily, and the entire text is about transformation of the mind. And if you look at the number of sutras out of 190 odd, there might be 5 sutras at the most that talk about asana and pranayama. Yeah, a few others, maybe another 20, are talking about things like yama, niyama, and all of that. And all of these, which is about 25 sutras or so on the whole, would be dealing with what is called Bahiranga Yoga. Bahiranga Yoga means that which is external, that which can be observed. Yeah. And then you have at least about 70 to 80 sutras, which are referred to as the Antaranga Sadhana. And this is the area that often gets left out. Yeah. And then you have another, almost 80 to 100 sutras that talk about the extraordinary benefits of having transformed yourself through Antaranga Sadhana. This is called Parama Antaranga Sadhana. These are the levels of samadhi and things like that become very esoteric, and people love to talk about it. Yeah. So the most critical part in my assessment, which is the actual transformation of a mind that is capable of entering states of samadhi, is left out. And there's a focus on the external elements, and then there's a focus on the esoteric elements if you haven't understood the middle ground. So that is the area that I've been focusing on. And it's an extremely beautiful area, and it's all about underlying transformations, which are very close to what psychology talks about. Yeah. Now, if we are talking about psychology, then we have to talk about states of mind and so on. So how does the Yoga Sutra approach this? Right? The Yoga Sutra talks about 5 states of mind. Yeah, and they are descriptors, very beautiful descriptors. So one state of mind is called Chipta, which is mind like a monkey. You might have heard this term, right? So it's a very distracted kind of mind. And then you have another mind called Mudha, which is mind like mud. Yeah, beautiful, simple descriptors. And then you have what is called the Chipta, Vikshipta mind, which is more or less like our minds. Yeah, it can sometimes be focused, sometimes distracted, sometimes dull, and so on. So it's capable of insight, it is capable of self-reflection. And then you come to a state of mind called Ekagrata, which is also fairly well known, which is the one-pointed, so-called one-pointed mind. And then the mind enters states of samadhi. Yeah. Now, according to my teacher, Krishnamacharya, and Deshikachar, whom I studied with, according to Krishnamacharya, you do asana and pranayama in the ashramas. You learn asana, pranayama, and the basic behavioral practices before you come to Yoga Sutra. So when it says Atha Yoganushasana, it's a mind that has done asana and pranayama and so on, so that from a mind like mud and a mind like a monkey, you have now come into the state of a mind that is capable of self-reflection. Right? And then the Yoga Sutra takes you through very beautiful steps of what this inward reflective process is. Yeah. And the focus of yoga is ending of dukkha. Yeah. So it uses terms like dukkha nivarana. And how does it happen? It happens through your ability to observe the tangible world, to observe and understand what is hidden and intangible behind it, and understand the viewer.
So, Raghuji, just a quick interruption. Ending of dukkha. Ending of dukkha means ending of sorrow, right?
Of suffering, sorrow.
Suffering,
we'll give it a broad descriptor.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because if you want to, maybe I should describe the word dukkha a little bit. There are 2-3 very interesting descriptions. One description is like a crushed pot or a crushed tin. One description of dukkha is a crushed tin. Yeah. The other description of yoga is dukkha is loss of self determination. Okay. So these are all some of the descriptors of dukkha. Right. So how do you end dukkha is the central question. And if you now go back to what Anandji is saying, it encompasses a lot more than just observations at the surface of behavior. So the vyakta part or the tangible part is observing certain things that are, observable, measurable. And then you go much deeper into what is behind it. And you also start questioning who is the observer. So when you do all these 3 together, you start entering the space of swadhyaya that Anandji talked about. Yeah. And, he used the word tapas. There's a very interesting understanding of tapas, which is not austerities, but ripening. So the entire practice of yoga is to ripen the mind. So stage by stage, all those, inner habits, ways of looking at the world, ways of understanding oneself and the world drop away. So all of those ways that are causing dukkha for me, all of those ways that are making my mind dull or my mind restless, not capable of self-reflection, fall away, right? And the practices for this is not asana and pranayama. The practice for this is a reflective practice. Yeah. So I have to be able to ask the question, what does my action mean in terms of an inside-out perspective? So a key question to get into Swadhyaya is, in doing what I'm doing, what am I really doing? Yeah, I'm giving you a quick English translation of a shloka that comes in the Bhagavad Gita, but this is a critical question. So if a person has not asked the question, in doing what I'm doing, what am I really doing, you don't enter Swadhyaya and you don't start the self-reflective process. Yeah. And this is where a lot of the work I'm doing in Antaranga Yoga has its focus. What I have found is that using Mahabharata, using dance, using theater are very powerful ways of getting into a Swadhyaya process. Yeah, it does something extraordinarily beautiful, because when you're looking at a very intense theater performance, or when you listen to a story, and what is recommended is not just reading a story. I'll come back to this in a moment. Yeah. Now, when you do this, it enables you to look at various things that give you dukkha, which give you suffering and so on, in a space that is not too far away, nor is it too close. Yeah, this is a very important recommendation in Sankhya. If I have to look at myself and observe, I have to find the right distance. So when I watch a play, I'm evoked in many ways, which are not totally personal, but the evocations are of me. So it allows me to examine myself in a way that is safe, that can be very deep, and that can be very insightful. So Mahabharata is one extremely powerful mode for doing this. Yeah. And why I said that listening is more important than reading, because what is recommended is Shravanam. Okay, Shravanam, Mananam, Nididhyasitavya. That's the process that is followed for any internal learning. When you listen to somebody talking, now if you had read what Anandji had said just now, I'm listening only to myself, because when I'm reading, it's like an internal dialogue. When I'm listening to Anandji, I'm encountering the whole person, right? And I can sense meanings that Anandji might be using words with, which are not my meaning. But if I'm reading something, I'm only reconfirming my own meanings. So the Shravanam process is very, very critical. So you listen to the stories, right? You listen to other people's understanding of the stories. And this kind of listening and encounter with other people, the meanings they give to a story, then becomes the starting point of self-reflection. So let's say I share with you a story of Draupadi, right? It's a very evocative story. So the initial response that people have is to talk about Draupadi. But the emotion that comes in when you're speaking about Draupadi belongs to me. So can I then start stepping back and saying, in doing what I'm doing, what am I really doing? When I'm investing this particular meaning to the experience of Draupadi, what part of me is getting evoked? So that step brings me to looking at myself, and I can start then looking at where I'm creating my idea of the world from. What particular meanings am I giving to myself? What particular meanings am I giving to the world around? What metaphors am I using to describe my world? There are a number of possibilities that arise once I start taking this inward step. And then once I've started this journey, I can go very deep inside, understand and have insight into where my dukkha starts from inside me. How am I creating my dukkha? And what are the seeds of dukkha that I have, which are sitting inside? These are called the samskaras and the vasanas. And when I have insight into the samskaras and vasanas, there's a transformation. Yeah. And this entire process is the Antaranga Yoga process. And after this, you are open to states of samadhi. Your mind becomes capable of perception, which is very accurate, not only of yourself, but of the world around you. And this mind, according to yoga, is essential for any pursuit you want to take. So if you're a scientist, yoga recommends that unless you have this quality of ekagrata, where I have understood myself, understood my own motivations, and understood what the colorings of my mind are, I cannot observe the world. I cannot observe myself, and so on. So the third chapter actually gives you 30 or 40 areas where you can apply your expertise. One of the areas is communication. How do I understand language? How do I understand power and strength? How do I understand astronomy? How do I understand other people's body and health? How do I understand the nature of the universe? How do I understand Prakriti in its essential qualities? How do I understand the nature of Purusha? All of these questions you can put your mind to. But first, you ought to have crossed these transformation points and discovered what an ekagrata mind is. And the interesting thing is, when you reach a mind that is capable of ekagrata, you've also shed your dukkha causing processes within your own mind. So in a sense, Antaranga Yoga is psychology plus, if I may say that, and Anandji would be okay with it. And after that, it goes into plus, which is various states of samadhi and so on. But to me, when people talk about states of samadhi without having actually crossed this process of Antaranga sadhana, it becomes what Krishnamacharya used to call vikalpa, imagination. So I can give you beautiful descriptors of samadhi, but just because I've given you a descriptor of samadhi, it doesn't mean I know. So the Antaranga sadhana is a very critical part, which at one level is psychological transformation, at another level is actually a deep preparation for anything you want to do in life. Yeah?
Very good.
So that is broadly what it's all about.
So Raghuji, let me take off from here. I want to mention to all the listeners, we have 158 of them right now, including us, that Raghu Ananthanarayanan is offering a course called Antaranga Yoga, starting in the summer quarter, the Hindu University of America. It starts around the second week of July. We're going to now invite Rama Koneruji to speak briefly about her experience of having been in 2 successive quarters of courses with Raghuji. One was called Antaranga Yoga, the other was called Antaranga Mandapam. Over to you, Ramaji, and then I'll come back and pick up another question.
Thank you, Kalyanji. And namaste, everybody. I have been a student of yoga for the past few years, and I've taken, like Kalyanji said, a couple of courses with Raghuji. But this Antaranga process has definitely deepened my learning at a very crucial time in my life. I have my anxieties just like everybody else here. You know, my son with health issues in college and another one on his way out, and, you know, me becoming an empty nester, you know, the usual stuff. In such situations, we usually hear the words turn inward, right? So if any of you have been in that situation where you're wondering what it is to turn inward, then this is absolutely the right course to go for, because this is a very practical way to start looking inward. So through this class, I was actually able to let go of some pretty deep-rooted ideas and thoughts that were causing me so much dukkha earlier. So this course definitely has a potential for very deep healing if one can immerse themselves wholly into it the way I was able to. And like Raghuji was saying, it's a process of, you know, putting yourself in the Mahabharata. And we all know intellectually that, you know, the Mahabharata and Ramayana are, you know, the battles that happen within each individual. But this course actually allowed me to see those battles within me, to experience those pulls and tugs. And it benefited me immensely because it showed me something that I hadn't seen in myself earlier, you know, consciously, strengths, vulnerabilities, as well as areas that I need to work on to bring out the best within me. What I liked best about this course was the student-led learning. So it was not lecture-based, whereas it was more like the, I suppose, the traditional Indic way of learning. So where I get to pick and choose, you know, what and how much I want to take away from the course. And so this made it less intimidating for me to actually throw myself into the course fully and immerse myself. I also like the format of the discussions that were held following the reflections. They worked really well for me, where my course students were actually handing me pieces of puzzle that I couldn't find. So it was kind of a group process that really worked well. And so today, when I read my reflections from, you know, a year, the beginning of the year before I started taking these courses, I realized that I have changed in ways that I didn't think I would. In the way I think and behave, and not just that, in the way I move, walk, and talk, and reflectively how the world around me has changed and how I interact with people. So, and definitely this is not an intellectual assessment, because, you know, my Western educated mind definitely needs tangible proof, you know, but I observe that there is a gentleness and a depth and effortlessness in my yoga practices and my dhyana, showing me that something is shifting within me as I've been immersing myself sincerely in this course and following all the practices that I learned from it. So I feel very supported in my process by this course. The other thing that I really appreciated was Raghuji was consistently redirecting our mind from, you know, our usual mode of operation of tarkam or logic and analysis of something external, where it's the Western way of understanding things from an external perspective, to the bhavna or the anubhuti of something within, or viewing it as an insider, which is traditionally the very Indian way of doing things. And for me, it was a very beautiful process of learning. So it was almost this training in dharana. The whole dharana process was happening during the class. So in putting myself in the Mahabharata, it helped me learn a lot about myself, because if you think about it, truly the way you understand something really is to become it and to understand it from its perspective. So that was the most awesome part of the class. So in conclusion, I would like to say that this course is definitely an invitation to turn inward, and it will benefit immensely anyone who accepts this invitation. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Ramaji. Let's continue. I want to ask one question for the two distinguished guests. And before we move to panelist questions, attendees questions. Okay. The question is as follows. In the West, we do have this process of counseling, or therapy. And sometimes it takes the form of group therapy and so on, which are in and of themselves quite effective in dealing with or coming to terms with wounds and injuries, emotional injuries one has suffered in the past. Okay. Now, I wish to ask both of you to reflect a little bit on how do you understand and contrast the methods of counseling and therapy in the West with the process of dharana as articulated by Patanjali, and where do they lead? What is their sort of end point? How do you reconcile the similarities and differences between those two processes? Anandji, you can take a few minutes, and then I'm going to restrict you to three minutes each, if you don't mind. Anandji, you have to unmute yourself. Okay. Unmute yourself, please.
Okay, I'll unmute.
Yes.
Am I heard?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Because Western psychology is so diverse, as I was saying, about a couple of trends can be seen. Psychoanalysis is one. What's called mainstream psychology, that what most people do is develop questionnaires and then work on a lot of statistics, which stays there, but doesn't necessarily reach the Antaranga Yoga. But then there is another trend, a third one, called Humanistic Psychology, which has led to a different perspective on, because basically the behavioristic perspective is one in which a skillful use of rewards or withdrawal of rewards, called negative reinforcement, is used to shape people's behavior. As a colleague of mine who does behavioristic psychology, I said, how do you go about? He says, well, the people have to tell me what the symptoms are, and I can tell you how to get rid of the symptoms. That's the way that particular approach works. Whereas the humanistic psychology works in a different way, because it matters there as to what people say and how the person doing counseling listens. And then there are a number of different ways in which they are taught to handle the interaction and help people. There are a number of different ways within it. So the yoga approach is, of course, radically different. It is self-directed in a much more deeper way, as Raghuji was saying. I'm not sure I'm answering the question pointedly.
Okay. Well, anyway, we've given us a perspective. Raghuji, how about you? Can you take a shot at this?
Yeah. It's a big question, Kalyanji.
Yeah,
okay.
3 minutes.
3 minutes. Yeah. The first quick response is that many forms of this kind of counseling over the last few years have come from studying Eastern methodologies. Okay, so humanistic psychology has a lot of influence of Taoistic philosophy. Gestalt has a lot of Zen. There's a lot of stuff today called DBT and CBT, which are all Buddhist methods that have been brought in. Yeah, so having said that, there is a fundamental difference between the yogic way of looking at it, though at one level there are similarities. What yoga says is that my body and my psyche and everything is one unit. It's not two separate things, right? So interestingly, like Rama said, the way I walk, the way I talk, what I feel, how I perceive the world, everything is reflecting the form and the shape of my psyche. So it doesn't matter where I start from. I just have to learn to observe my psyche in action. And when I learn how to observe my psyche in action, I start understanding where and how I'm distorting my body, I'm distorting my understanding, my emotional responses, and so on. So a lot of the focus is just on my ability to observe here and now myself in action, right? So, for example, Krishnamacharya would say that asana practice is dhyana on the body, right? Now, when you approach asana practice like this, it's quite incredible. You do an intense asana with deep breathing and good focus. There's a good chance that you'll remember things from your past. There'll be a release of a certain kind. I've actually had dramatic things happening in my classes. Like I give a very simple asana to this person. I remember one, the first time it happened, which is very shocking for me. This person comes out to the asana and starts weeping. And what has happened is she has remembered her entire divorce process that happened 10 years back. So the pain was held in the body in a certain way and so on. And being able to do the asana and then having an insight into what happened and being able to deal with the feelings that come up was an insight. And from that point, her whole demeanor changed, a lot of things changed. So there are a lot of questions here, Kalyanji. For example, yoga does not believe that memory is in the brain. Memory is in every part of my system. It's all over in my prakriti in different ways. A different subtleness of observation, I can release these distortions in my being. And here I'm not talking about some esoteric thing when I'm saying being. I'm talking about an existential sense of me. Yeah, dukkha is this me has held on to a lot of distorting factors. And when I understand how to do dharana, I actually directly release them from inside. Yeah. And this is why this part of yoga is not easy to teach. I can ask you to bend your, back and touch your toes, but how do I enable you to, touch certain parts of your insides which you're afraid to approach, and therefore distorted yourself? Yeah, and this is where the Swadhyaya processes and Mahabharata become so powerful.
Wonderful. Very good. So here is one more question, and I'm going to take a question asked by one of the participants in the webinar and frame it slightly differently. While the modern methods of counseling and therapy, modern in the sense Western methods of counseling and therapy, do focus on traumas and hurts and pains from earlier on in one's life, in one's own childhood, or other traumatic events in one's life journey. They rarely go beyond the beginning of this life. They do not go into past lives, for example. Whereas yoga is totally grounded in the idea of past lives, and the succession of lives, and the idea that we bring vasanas and samskaras, which include pain and suffering from prior lifetimes into this current life. Okay. At the same time, there are some unique studies being done, and there is one of the panelists has called attention to some research being done in UVA. Ian Stevenson's research at UVA on reincarnation, and why most Western psychologists have completely ignored these his findings, so to speak. So Anandji, do you have a quick view on this? I'm going to unmute you.
Yes, I can Stevenson's work is very important, and it will be all dismissed and has been dismissed by people. You cannot, the psychoanalysis helps you to go back into your own early childhood history and heal from that point of view, which is also possible. But the belief in reincarnation is antithetical to Western ways of thinking completely. What is strange about it is that my colleagues who are into what is called evolutionary psychology, they talk about how your behavior is influenced by what happened to insects when they developed million years ago. And that's okay for them, but not your own life, because your own life is supposed to be starting with your first breath, and that's it. There is your DNA may be influencing you in your way, but it has not passed on to you any kind of vasanas. So the Indian way of looking at it is to examine your vasanas, where they come from. And they may have come from your genetic history. Whether you want to call it, earlier life, or whether you want to call your, phylogenetic background, makes actually the same thing. You name it differently.
Yeah. Okay, very good. Thank you, Anandji. Now, just Raghuji, I'm going to give you a shot at this same question. Just a second, okay? I want to recognize that we have just passed the hour. Yeah. So we've completed 1 hour, and we're going to continue for a few more minutes, maybe another 10 or 15 minutes with a couple more questions. So I invite everybody to stick around. It's very rare to have these two gentlemen together on one webinar. So we're going to kind of take advantage of that a few more minutes here, okay? So I also want to make a quick recommendation to people in the conversation to really check out this course called Antaranga Yoga, which is starting in the second week of July in, remotely via Zoom, just like today at Hindu University of America. Okay, Raghuji, over to you. Now, have you experienced these past life memories coming up in these sessions of yoga, and how do you situate that?
You're excelling yourself in asking difficult questions, Kalyanji. Okay, I'm not going to answer you directly. I'm not going to answer you directly. I'm going to go into two things. One is, there is a Yoga Sutra. There's sutra that talks specifically about this. It says samskara sakshat karanat purva jati jnanam. Okay, now samskara here refers to the same thing as what vasana that Anandji was talking about. And it says, if I observe my samskara, right, in a certain way, this is a practice of dhyana and samadhi in these areas of the self, then purva jati jnanam happens. Now, practically,
what is purva jati?
Purva jati is what you're saying. Purva jati means my earlier form and so on. Yeah, so it could go all the way to my previous births.
Yeah.
Okay, so the way it happens is this. Now, when I get in touch with my vasana and I have a moment of epiphany in the here and now, and through my direct dhyana, my direct attentiveness on the vasana, I've released it, then memories that were there, that have been held within this particular knot, come back to me. So it's not the opposite, the other way about. It's not as though I go back and say, what was my potty training, and therefore discover what's happening to me now. I experience this vasana in its seed form. And when I look at it, when I have an insight into it, that insight reveals why this vasana got formed to start with. So in that process, one can go back all the way to birth trauma. One can go back to other events, right? And also, like Anandji said, the word, vasana has a lot of connotations. There's one statement that says the lives of 14 people impact the birth, the child as soon as it's born. 14 people is just your father and your mother, their parents, and so on, 3 generations. So just the fact that that context has certain memories, it has certain ways of looking at the world, whether it is stated or unstated, impact the child. So number of things impact the child. So in several homes, for example, there are traumas that lie unstated, that lie covered up, unacknowledged completely, not even talked about. Yeah, I've experienced people getting in touch with it, discovering things, going back then and talking to their parents and discovering that yes, indeed there has been a trauma in the family, and by discovering it, this person has let go of the dukkha that they are carrying on behalf of the family.
Yeah.
But the process is almost the opposite, Kalyanji. It's not by going and looking for my previous birth that something happens. It's by observing myself in the here and now at a certain degree of subtlety that these memories come back.
They resurface from the past.
They resurface because they are held inside like a seed. They're held
Yeah.
inside that energy packet of mine.
Wonderful. So there's a question about this person by the name Brian Weiss.
Oh, yeah.
You say that. So he has done a lot of work on
Yeah. I've read his books.
past life regression therapies and specific methods of reaching into the remote past in our lives. So any comments on his work and how it reconciles or relates to the Yoga Sutras and the methods of yoga in general? That's a question. That's a question from one of the attendees. Okay.
That's the question.
Yeah.
Okay. I've had some strange experiences in these areas because of my interest in yoga, people ask me to do this, do that. Mm-hmm. And I don't know about Brian Weiss. Some friends of mine have worked with it. Personally, I'm not convinced that whatever I went through was very different from my own ability to dream into things and create images for myself. Okay. I'm not convinced of that. Yeah. So in yoga also, there are several processes like yoga nidra and all that, which are not very different from what Brian Weiss talks about.
Sure.
Yeah?
I mean,
and in those kind of practices, you get into a dream-like, I don't know what it's called in psychology, half dream, half awake state, right? And that's a beautiful state to be in, and it's a very insightful state to be in. So things happen in that state.
Yeah. Okay.
I don't know. Yeah. Beyond that.
You don't know beyond that. Okay. Very good. Now, let me ask a different question entirely. This is coming from one of the participants as well, which is number one, are Western psychologists or the Western practice of psychology, is it even open today to exploring ideas from the world of yoga? Are they investigating it? Do they have methods of exploring ideas from the world of yoga that are at least commensurate with what the world of yoga itself is saying? And do you, Anandji, do you see any difference between psychologists who actually practice yoga from those who don't practice yoga? So it's an interesting question.
When people ask me, am on? Okay. When people ask me, do you do yoga?
Yeah.
I think they know what they are talking about, which is asanas. And I say no. My guru never asked me. I asked my guru to whether or not I need to do asanas. I will tell you what he told me. He told me that, look, he says, when you want to write something, do you sleep? I says, no. So you are taking the appropriate pose naturally. The asana is appropriate to what you're doing, which is natural. If you look at what basically the sthira sukham asana, sthira and sukha are the two characteristics of asana that Patanjali talks about. Okay. And so doing Antaranga Yoga, for instance, is something that happened to me because Swadhyaya is something that was inculcated for various reasons in my life. It happened. And that is doing yoga. I discovered that much late in my life. Swadhyaya is something that I turned to psychology because I was looking at myself and I explored a number of different ways of how self means in Western psychology. That was Swadhyaya. And that is yoga.
Interesting. Okay. Anandji, what is your view about Western reception of yoga in the psychology discipline?
Good question. The last, I am retired almost for about 19, 20 years now, so I'm not in touch with what is happening in the scene in a way I used to by attending conferences and all. Yet, what is happening, I mean, I tried to get in Indian approaches to psychology in Western mode. A recent attempt of mine, that also in an APA journal, the American Psychological Association runs many, many journals, of which there is one called Psychology of Religion and Spirituality. My submission to that was summarily rejected. Even there, when it was almost an invited paper within the APA. So the reason for that is that one of the things that they ask when you try to publish something, where is your data? And what they mean by data is making observations of somebody else's behavior and then doing some kind of statistics. I said, no, that is not as relevant. It may be useful in some ways, but to do yoga, you don't need data of any kind. You need to only look at yourself. So these are barriers in entering a certain way of making sense of anything about life, which is in the conventional Indian sense of the term, avidya. And avidya is not ignorance. Avidya is empirical knowledge.
Absolutely.
And you have to go in yoga from avidya to vidya, and vidya is self-knowledge.
Yeah,
That's the big difference.
Yeah.
So almost an unbridgeable difference, would you say?
Yes.
No, I don't think, Kalyanji, I don't think it's an unbridgeable distance, because a lot of stuff, like I told you earlier, DBT, CBT takes directly from Buddhist meditative practices. They acknowledge it. Yeah, every one of the first authors, from Jung to Gestalt, several people in Gestalt to whatever, have referred directly to yoga or to Buddhist texts. Yeah, there's some other stuff going on which doesn't allow Anandji to write a paper there, which, you know, this may not be the place to talk about it. There's something else going on. But are ideas from yoga being used? Yes, they are. And they're given different names. That's the reality today.
Yeah.
And because of this, it's not even understood fully. So yeah, it's a peculiar loss actually that's going on, but it's commercially viable, it's politically acceptable, and so on.
Yeah.
That's the reality of what's happening today, in my understanding.
So there are two phenomena happening. One is that ideas from yoga are being reconstituted with completely different terminology to make it acceptable within the Western worldview of the development of psychology. And second is that it is getting buttressed by so-called empirical studies that produce data about other people doing yoga, practicing certain techniques, which then lends a certain statistical credibility to the claims being made by those papers. And unless these two conditions are satisfied, then I suppose the peer reviews will not publish your paper. Anand, am I on target here in my supposition? More or less.
This is a much bigger topic, Kalyanji, because we'll have to discuss it. There is first-person research that is possible to be looked at, but I don't know what's going on there.
Okay. All right, very good. So I think we've taken 15 minutes over our time. I want to thank everybody who attended the webinar today, and really thank the panelists for joining us for this webinar. Thank you, everybody. And Ankurji, why don't you take the final word and close this webinar?
Yeah, thank you. Again, thank you all for being on. It's been every week, and we have amazing conversations about the depth and breadth of Hinduism. And Raghuji, Dr. Varanjpe, thank you for having this awesome conversation. Ramaji, thank you for sharing your perspective as a student. Hopefully, many of you will enroll in this particular course, but check out all of our courses. I actually saw somebody enroll during this webinar. So please participate. This is your university. This is our university. We need to have these conversations. Please join us in the future as well. Thank
Beautiful.
you all for being a part of this.
Terrific. And one final word from me. If you want to get involved with the university, the Hindu University of America, a wonderful place to begin is the Orientation to Hindu Studies course. Orientation to Hindu Studies. Antaranga Yoga is just an equally good entry point to get in. Okay. Thank you very much, everybody.
All right,
Namaste.
thank you, everyone. Namaste. Bye.
You can end it. Namaste.